I'll just show you guys how I review, and it's been super helpful. So this is kind of how I do it. As you can see, I've done like quite a lot of, this is just like for each PT. So as like I've done more, I just like keep adding tabs. So like, for example, I did this one right before my April exam. And the way that this is exactly how I do it. So I put the question number, the type of question, the provable powerful. If you've read the LSAT loophole, that's from this. So the basic idea is that there's provable answers and there's powerful answers. And so provable would be for something like would be for a necessary assumption or must be true, most strongly supported, because it has to be provable by the stimulus, versus a powerful answer would be for something like sufficient assumption, weaken or strengthen, because it has to be powerful enough to weaken or strengthen or do something. So you're using outside information. So that's just helpful for me to see, like if there's certain types of questions that I need to focus on. And then I only do the questions that I either flagged, and I'm very liberal with my flagging, or I got incorrect. So then what I do is I look at the stimulus, I like go through it, I type out, I always identify the conclusion first, and then I look at, I try to pre-phrase it essentially when I review, and then I'll look at the correct answer. And like, as you can see, I'll be like, the reason that I flagged this, even though I got it right, was because blah, blah, blah. So just like seeing like why I wasn't confident in my answer, so I can know to be confident in it the next time I run into something similar. I'll put the wrong/tempting answers just to see like what was potentially tricky about it, and then what went wrong. And sometimes there's like nothing, as you can see, I didn't really put as many what I needed to do differently, but I have a space for that too. And then I just do that for the whole section. And I do something similar for RC and logic games. And that's like, I think I learned that from like a combination of people from this community and like Steve's when I first started joining these classes. So it is time consuming, but it's definitely really helpful. And then you can, I think for me, by taking the time to actually type that out, it really makes me focus on what I got wrong, and is a good review process just to like take the time to do that. So Solomon asks, thanks, do you do that for drilling as well or only for PT? So anytime I take a full section, so even if I'm just doing like a section of logic of LR, I'll still review that, and I'll do the same for a full PT. I might not do it if I'm just like warming up or doing like drills, but to be honest, I haven't done drills in a while because I'm just focused on like doing full sections at this point. But I would, if you're drilling, I would recommend like fully reviewing in the same fashion if you have time. But just for the ones that you either flagged or got wrong, you don't necessarily have to do that, in my opinion, for the ones that you got correct.
Casey, do you feel that like after you write all that stuff out that you understand better, like just by going on why you got it wrong, why that the one answer is correct?
Yeah, I think like a big turning point in my score getting better for LR was me really honing in on the stimulus and like focusing, because I feel like once I had like a basic understanding of the question types and things like that, it was really not silly mistakes, because like I made a mistake, so it wasn't necessarily silly because I made that mistake, but things that like it was like a hyper attention to detail. So when I would like go through and write it out, I would often see why I got it wrong even before I reviewed it, by like focusing on the stimulus and then being like, oh, okay, I see it now. And I don't know if I showed an example in that one PT that I was doing, but you can also see like I would look, like I told you, at other websites and be like, Power Score said like this was the explanation that they used and this made a lot of sense to me, and I see how I like missed the word most versus some in the stimulus or something like that. So it definitely, like, to answer your question, I definitely, I won't move on to the next question until I feel like I have a full understanding of either why I flagged something or why I got it wrong. Or if it's really difficult, then I'll highlight that box and I'll bring it up to my study group and be like, this one I just don't understand. Can we like talk it out? So yes, to answer your question.
Got it. Thanks.
Yeah. Is everybody planning on taking in June or in August? What is everybody's plans? Or that you're not sure yet? June. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure everybody knows this at this point, but June will be nice because it's the last. Okay, cool. August, yeah. June will be the last one with just the 3 sections, and then August we'll have the experimental section again. But at least with the experimental section, that won't affect your actual score. And it'll still be flex, which will be nice. I guess like for those of you, I'm sure you've like heard about the flex and everything, but I guess just some tips that I didn't know, and this is that, or some people told me before going in that was helpful, was so that you can pick your time that you register. So I registered for 10:40, but by the time I actually took the exam, it was probably like 11:20 or something. So it takes like, it can take 20 minutes or so for the proctor to, because I had to like load things, like something at first, like the exam wasn't loading on my computer and like I had to refresh it with the proctor, and the proctor has you like show your workspace and everything, and like you have to read this pledge. So just be aware that whatever time you register, you probably won't be taking it until 20 or 30 minutes after that point. And fun fact, you can actually look, you can see after you do your writing sample, you can go in LSAT and read it, which is just a fun fact. It doesn't really affect your score. Is anyone having like specific things that they're struggling with? It could be like timing or anything like that that they want to talk about.
Yeah, it could be this is what you were really discussing with Brittany earlier. On your logic games like introduction, so you mentioned 2 things. Number one is about reading the stimulus versus reading the question, and also about thinking about the general question without thinking about the general stimulus without thinking about the question. You just find your own flaws in it without, or what do you find wrong with this argument, irrespective of what they're asking. I was wondering how the 2 pieces go together. So you said that it definitely is a good idea to read the questions them first, just to know what you're looking for. But if you're trying to think of it as an overall argument, like how would I respond to that in a conversation? So then, if I'm looking with specific information that the question's giving me, I'm going to be a little bit slanted.
That's a great question. So Moshe is pointing out like a kind of contradiction or apparent contradiction in what I say, because on the one hand, I do like to read the question stem before the stimulus and logical reasoning. But at the same time, I'm advocating that as a more advanced prep technique, look at the method of reasoning independent of the question type. So that's a great question. And the answer is that ultimately, I don't think it really matters that much whether you read question stem first or stimulus first. However, I do think that it's important to know what the question's asking you. And personally, I found when I was reading stimulus first, I would read the question stem, then read the stimulus again. And so I find it more efficient to read question stem first. Plus, I find it really useful to go into the stimulus knowing what to look for. Now, if you simply want to, as part of your review process, better understand more complex methods of reasoning, then the question type doesn't matter, and you can focus exclusively on just evaluating the reasoning in the argument. But under test day conditions, I personally find it really useful to read the question stem to know what my objective is, what I'm looking to do. Because for a strengthen or weaken question, I'm looking to evaluate the gap and do something with the gap in the argument. But for a fact set, like a must be true question, there's no point at looking for gaps because there isn't likely going to be a gap at all, especially if it's just a fact set alone. Does that address your question, Moshe?
Yeah, basically, if I understand your answer, really is it's more of a technique for studying just to gain a better understanding of games in general, but not necessarily something to do when you're trying to do a time test. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. So to better understand more difficult logical reasoning questions, I would focus on the stimulus if I'm proficient in question types. But then, yes, on test day, I would read question stem to know how to approach the argument from a particular perspective. Well, one thing I'll say is regarding the conclusion, I mean, finding the conclusion, to me, that's the first step because that applies to virtually all of LR with the exception of fact sets. And so you want to be good at identifying conclusions. And you have, of course, indicator words like thus, therefore, hence, and many, many others. I have lists of them inside the course. And so I would start there and work on the basics because this will have a ripple effect throughout all of logical reasoning, conclusion indicators, evidence indicators. Then separately, you have necessary condition indicators and sufficient condition indicators, which again carry through a lot of LR and then games as well. So everything's kind of tied together. But aside from that, you're asking about necessary assumption questions in particular. And so yes, you definitely want to find the gap, something new mentioned in the conclusion that did not appear in the evidence. That new thing in the conclusion, its presence needs to be justified in order for the argument to be valid. And so if we consider the argument as given, there would need to be a link between the two. So that's a theoretical way to think about it. But then practically, of course, we have the negation test. The correct answer choice when negated will destroy the argument. It will destroy the argument because the original necessary assumption is required by the argument. So I don't always apply the negation test quite so mechanically where I'm physically like negating every single phrase. I'm more just simply asking myself, does this need to be true? If not, what would happen? So an example I like to use for this is, let's say we have given God created the world. A necessary assumption underlying this argument is that there is or was a God at some point. If you negate that and say there wasn't, then how could God have created the world? It's required. It's implicit within the given statement. So the necessary assumption will not always be stated directly. An assumption, one definition is that it's an unstated premise. So like if I have a dollar bill, it's implicit that I have the value of 25 cents, 10 cents, 50 cents, and of course more than that, but it's all contained within. How does that all strike you?
It makes sense to me.
And then we have denying gaps as the other thing you mentioned. So denying a gap is like the second category, the rattlesnake folktale question, again, in prep test 30. Prep test 30, section 2, I think it's question 22, if I remember correctly. So this question, I'm not going to give the whole thing away, but the idea is that there is a new thing in the conclusion, and they're saying, don't worry about that new thing referenced in the conclusion. It's not a problem. So to me, that is denying a gap somebody could have brought up and saying, you might think there's a gap there, but we're addressing it. So connecting and filling in a gap, connecting evidence and conclusion to fill in a gap, alternatively denying the existence of a gap that somebody might have suggested. So those are the two that I come across. Those are the two that as I think about it. I'm not trying to think about it so abstractly when I'm solving problems, though. I'm just asking myself, as I go through each choice, does this need to be true? And if it weren't true, what would happen? Correct answer choice when negated destroys the argument, leaving no ambiguity at all. So this is the negation test or denial test, negating the answer choices or denying the answer choices, depending on how you think about it.
That makes sense. No, thank you. I guess for now, I guess I'll put it into the most likely most of them fall into this camp, but it could be true that there's at least one that doesn't. No, that makes sense. Because
for sure.
Yeah, because I was just trying to, as I'm going through my study, I'm like, okay, that makes, the way you explained it made a lot of sense. And I was like, okay, let me just make sure if I submit this, I don't see something else. And I'm like, oh, wait, that can be different. And the reason why I asked, because obviously two of those have kind of different approaches, right? Like you said with the rattlesnake one, that one kind of threw me off. The answer made sense, but I wasn't sure why my other answer didn't make sense, but I had to really dive into it. Because I think I had chosen like answer B that talked about like the snake's tail or something like that had to be the same. And I think the difference was just that I was talking about species within versus different. But anyway, I'll let people look at the question again. But yeah, that kind of brings me to my second question, which was that for the first approach where you had to fill in the gap, I was curious as to if because I know typically for what happens with the one is with the gap is that there's a conclusion, like they say this random stuff, and then there's this conclusion, and you're like, wait, what? How did you get there? And you have to kind of try to fill that in, right, with the answer choices. So I guess I was trying to ask, does the answer choice, which is an assumption, which is basically an unstated premise, right? So does the answer choice have to be a premise that can support the conclusion by itself, or does it have to connect to the other premises in the stimulus to prove the conclusion? I don't know if that question makes sense.
Would you mind just repeating that again so that I catch it and everyone else catches it too?
No problem. So essentially, I'm trying to ask if the answer choice, which is an unstated premise that's supposed to fill in the gap for the conclusion, can that premise by itself support the conclusion, like alone, or does it need to connect to the other premises in the stimulus together to support this conclusion? So either can it stand alone by itself to support the conclusion, or does it need to connect somehow to the other premises to support the conclusion as well?
That's a great question. I would think about it primarily as connecting back to the evidence or the premise in some way, because this is an assumption the argument relies upon, not that the conclusion alone relies upon.
That's a good point.
So just like for a strengthening question or a weakening question, we're looking to strengthen the argument or weaken the argument. And the argument is the combination of both the evidence and the conclusion. We're not looking at the conclusion in isolation. So when we look to strengthen the reasoning or weaken the reasoning is the argument, the reasoning is the connection between evidence and conclusion. So for a necessary assumption that the argument relies upon or depends upon or assumes, the argument relying upon it means the entire thing is relying upon it. So I wouldn't look at the assumption, the necessary assumption and the conclusion alone, or those two parts specifically. I'd also look to bring in the evidence.
Okay. And can I ask a follow-up to that real quick?
Sure.
And no, that makes sense, I guess, because you're talking, it's the whole argument. So I guess I'm trying to understand, does it have to be the case that it connects, I guess, that it does relate to the other premises in some way, or can it sometimes not, and sometimes as long as it helps the argument in a sense? Or let me clarify, should I clarify that?
Well, if it's helping the argument, it's helping the entire thing.
Right. I guess the reason why what I'm unclear about is the fact that because the conclusion is a conclusion because it's supported by a premise, right? Or one premise or premises, right? So if I just put a conclusion out there, if I can just bring in one premise, then even that premise by itself should be okay to support that conclusion if the premise itself is strong. So that's why I guess I'm unclear, because if the premise and answer choice is strong enough by itself to support the conclusion, then it can be a strong conclusion because it has a strong premise. But I wasn't sure if that strong premise in the answer choice also has to relate to the other premises, because I don't necessarily think that always needs to happen in an argument. It can just be like, hey, this is just one really strong premise and that supports this strong conclusion. But I might be overthinking it. I don't know, in a way. So.
I think you might be overthinking it as well. I don't want you to necessarily get so theoretical or abstract about it. These are not things that I typically think about myself when I would be solving a question. I don't think that anyone really needs to. I would think more about it simply, does the argument require this? An argument can require many, many things. And the things that an argument requires can relate to all of the premises or can relate to only some of them. If an argument has multiple premises, a necessary assumption, chances are it's not going to relate to every single one. And that's fine. The argument's the combination of all of them. Like, if something is true of the United States, it doesn't need to be true of all 50 individual states. It can relate to only specific states. Does that help?
Yeah, no, that helps. No, thanks. I like I said, I think as I dive in more, I'll be able to. But no, that definitely makes sense.
I also have a question just generally in terms of the LR section, how people are managing their time as well, because we have those really hard conditional, LRs or certain ones that are a lot longer than other passages. So how do you guys recommend dividing and conquering the LR section?
I'll leave this to others to chime in.
I'm happy to share something about my LR timing experience.
Sure.
Yeah, I had a lot of difficulties with the LR at the beginning, especially when I started doing timed sections. And what I found was that I would divide it up. So the first, 10 questions in the section, they're going to be easy. It's probably not going to have any sort of like trick answer choices. So those ones I would kind of force myself to do within the first 10 minutes. And then I would move on, and then I would find myself leaving at least 10 minutes for the last 5 questions. So from 20 to 25 or 26, I tend to leave around 10 minutes. In terms of pacing, what I found as I've now gone on doing practice tests is that don't rush it, I would say. I used to rush it. I used to think, oh my gosh, I don't have enough time to do this. Do I have enough time to diagram? Do I have enough time to go through all of this again, even though I didn't understand it the first time? And I would say that one of the most important things for me, at least in LR, is understanding the stimulus and the argument and the flaw of the argument before you move on to the answer choices, because they tend to have a lot of kind of language to trick you into picking them. So if you go into it truly understanding the argument of what the stimulus has, then you're able to go into it clear-minded and just pick, kind of pre-phrase and pick the right answer. So for me, usually I've slowed down a lot in terms of reading the stimulus. And, if I don't understand it the first time, sometimes it's like a really weird abstract science passage, for example, or, even formal logic. I'll usually read it, and if I don't get it, I'll read it again and make sure that I actually understand what the argument is before moving on to the answer choices.
Those are all great. I've said all of those before, but I think they're all worth repeating. So slowing down, getting the stimulus down thoroughly before moving on. The choices only make sense in the context of the stimulus. So it's worth taking the time to get it. And as Ayana said, skip things, come back to them. Everything's worth the same. I'll personally flag 3, 4, 5 questions in a single section just because I don't want to deal with them in the moment. And the last session I was discussing with Herb about principal application, parallel reasoning. I mentioned those because they're super difficult and time consuming. And those are ones that stick in my mind because I don't like encountering them, especially if they're late in the section, especially if they involve diagramming. But since everything's worth the same, come back to it later. And it might be worth taking 3 minutes on it, but only when you know that you've gotten everything else down.
But when I do the logical reasoning, I'm not really struggling with a certain question type per se. But it's more when they start to get more difficult, that's when I start to fall apart. So like question 12 or 15 is when I see the answers start to like pile up getting wrong. So just any tips on how to, increase my score with that?
Yeah, sure. First thing that comes to mind would be if there is a way you can speed up on the easier questions to have more time for the tougher ones. If you have a good foundation in logical reasoning, I would typically suggest that you take the first 10 minutes to do the first 10 questions, maybe 12 minutes, but you really approach them at a faster than average amount of time so that you build up a time bank to tackle those tougher ones later in the section.
Okay.
And also feel free to flag the 3 to 5 toughest problems you encounter in that section, skip them, come back to them at the end because they're the toughest ones, not worth doing those now if there are easier ones you could be doing instead. Because logical reasoning has a general order of difficulty, but not a perfect order of difficulty.
Okay, makes sense.
And also note if there are certain games that certain reasoning questions that typically give you a lot of trouble, like parallels or principal applications. Those might be questions to skip and come back to if you notice that they typically give you a lot of trouble.
Okay, great, thank you.